Look, it's become a perennial debate. Interesting, though, today, Andrew, proposal from Anthony Albanese, a referendum on constitutional recognition for First Australians could be held on January 26. So don't change the date, but perhaps broaden the meaning, in particular for First Australians. What do you make of that?
Well, Tom, Happy New Year and Happy Australia Day. Look, I think there is no doubt that Australia Day, while also being a difficult day for many Indigenous people, is also an opportunity for us to think about what great contribution Australia has made to so many people's lives. And that is very pertinent as we go through this pandemic, where, frankly, people don't want to be living in any country other than Australia. But in terms of the day itself, I think there is more that we can do to imbue the contribution of Indigenous Australia into the day itself. This morning I was at a smoking ceremony down at Barangaroo with the support of the New South Wales Land Council and the traditional owners, which I think is a very good way to start the day off. So all of these suggestions I think are worth looking at.
It's interesting to reflect on, even while this debate seems to go on every year and go back and forth, the day has changed a lot, Matt Thistlethwaite, even over the past 10 years or so.
Yeah, it certainly has changed, Tom, and I think it's wonderful that Australians do now recognise the wonderful contribution of the First Australians to our history and our culture. I'm standing on the edge of the waters of Botany Bay, where I've just been at a citizenship ceremony. And these are, of course, the cliffs and the waters where the Laperouse Aboriginal community have inherited this special place for many, many centuries. And it was their ancestors that were the first Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to see those tall ships come in through Botany Bay. So for them, I've spoken to that community. For them, this day isn't a day of celebration. It's a day of some hurt and sorrow. And I think that we have to respect that. And that's been the great thing about Australia Day in recent years, that there has been this movement to respect that. And we can have a debate like the one that Anthony suggested about having constitutional recognition on this day.
Andrew Bragg, I want to ask you about another headline today in The Australian. The Nationals pushing for more manufacturing jobs. Apparently it would need to come with up to 4 new coal-fired power plants. Are you getting a bit sick of this suggestion that never seems to go away and never seems to have any real support?
Well, I mean, we're in the middle of an energy transition where you're seeing a higher reliance on gas and a lower reliance upon coal, and ultimately a bigger reliance upon renewable energy, especially as the storage issues are resolved in that renewable space. So, I mean, that is the trend, I think, in energy generation. But other than that, I mean, I'm agnostic. I mean, I'm driven by the science, and the science is telling us that the cleanest, best transition is a combination of gas and renewables.
Well, let's be frank, though. I know you're a straight shooter. The Nationals are kidding themselves here, aren't they?
Well, as I say, I mean, I'm an agnostic about the form of generation. I mean, we want to have the cleanest and most reliable energy mix, and that's going to come from gas and from renewables over the medium term. And I think it's very unlikely that you're going to see new coal-fired power stations built in Australia. Certainly, the market is not willing to build these things, so I don't see why the government would.
So, I mean, you'd never support any government money to essentially underwrite new coal-fired power in Australia? Would you ever support that?
No, I would not.
All right, clear. Matt Thistlethwaite, what about Labor's various positions, if you like, on coal? A lot of talk out of the last election was, of course, the rhetoric on coal was all wrong. That's why we lost all those seats in Queensland. Is that still the case? Are the sands shifting a bit with the Biden administration?
Well, I think, Tom, that on all of these issues, the market will determine where the investment will be in the future, and that is what is occurring at the moment. And I think you're right to say that the Nationals are kidding themselves, because the market and the people investing in what are very, very big pieces of infrastructure are moving away from fossil fuels towards renewables for a number of reasons. Firstly, because it's better for our environment and we're going to leave a safer environment for our kids if we do so. But more importantly, on economic terms, it's cheaper. We all know that renewables, the cost of renewables is coming down year on year. So that technology of fossil fuel-based energy production is becoming outdated, and it doesn't make any sense. And I congratulate Andrew for saying that we shouldn't be putting public dollars into investing in outdated technology when the market's moving a completely separate way.
Matt, I want to ask you about the vaccine. We've got Labor carping about this. Australia has multiple vaccine options and AstraZeneca looking more promising and will be approved soon, which we can make here so we avoid the issues of production overseas. I mean, do you really think the Australian people agree that this has been mismanaged by the government?
Well, we're certainly behind the eight ball in terms of other nations getting access to the vaccine and rolling it out quicker than we've been able to. And that's a product, we believe, of the government not investing in enough options initially. We had one of those hit the fence in the UQ vaccine, and we knew that there was going to be situations where they couldn't all come to fruition. So better to make sure
that's why
that keep your options.
They invested in 4. I mean, what was the key number? Was it 5? Was it 6? 4 seems quite a bit. They're getting Pfizer not long after the others. We don't have much COVID here.
Those other nations have been able to roll it out more quickly than Australia has. Nonetheless,
they had emergency approvals.
Well, it's good news that the TGA has approved the vaccine for Australia, and in other cases when they've been approved, they've been rolled out almost immediately. So we are hopeful that the government will now get their act together and start rolling this vaccine out as quickly as possible, because the sooner we can vaccinate more of the population, the sooner we can begin lifting restrictions and getting more people back into employment.
But if Australians are listening to Labor's complaint on this and the overall situation with COVID, we have basically no COVID in the community. The first vaccine rollout's going to happen in 3 or 4 weeks. It doesn't seem to be something that's actually, when it comes to it, affecting the nation very much.
But we've also seen, Tom, just how quickly and rapidly COVID can spread. It only takes one case for the spread to go through the community very quickly and for borders to be locked, for that to have economic consequences for people's jobs. So if the TGA have approved and other nations have been able to roll out very quickly in the wake of those authorities approving, Australia should be able to as well.
What about those borders being locked and WA's approach right now? Do you agree with everything Mark McGowan's done?
Yeah, I do, because they're acting on the advice of their chief medical officers. And Labor's always said that it's the scientists that should dictate how we approach this. Now, I know that there are different approaches.
But there's not one answer from these professionals. I mean, the federal body set up and said, here's a national hotspot approach. New South Wales, your state, has been dealing with this. They've been managed to quash it each time and actually allow people in Australia to travel in and out of New South Wales. WA is just taking this to an extreme, aren't they?
2 points. Firstly, we believe you should take the advice of the medical experts, and that's what the Western Australian government is doing. And secondly, other states that have adopted a similar approach, for instance, Queensland, well, in the midst of that, the Queensland people had an election, and they overwhelmingly, with an increased majority, voted to return the Palaszczuk government because they accepted and they liked the approach that government was taking in protecting their citizens. So I think that Australian people have well and truly spoken about those issues.
Well, it seems like incumbency is the winner in COVID. Anyway, look, we're nearly out of time. I have not forgot about you, Andrew Bragg. What about the Moderna vaccine? We don't have access to that. Do we need a clear explanation as to why we couldn't get it? It might end up being the best candidate. Reports today that there's confidence it will also keep people still healthy from the latest strains.
Tom, we've availed ourselves to a mix of vaccines. Now, we don't have community transmission as is occurring in the US and the UK. And for that reason, our vaccination program can happen in a more orderly fashion. And that is a huge difference. Now, Mr Albanese is obviously suffering from having Mr Chalmers breathing down his neck for the leadership, so he's desperate to get a headline. But the reality is our better management of the coronavirus pandemic relative to comparable nations has meant that we can have an orderly rollout of the vaccine, which is going to happen next month. So I'd rather be in Australia than be anywhere else.
But we're nearly out of time. What about Moderna? Do we need to hear exactly the ins and outs of why we couldn't get it?
Well, I think we can look at all the options as we've been doing the whole time. It's science-led, and I think overall we've done well. So we'll put our record next to comparable governments.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Andrew Bragg, Matt Thistlethwaite,